Do you remember the lower-class foods that once held families together before they vanished from the table? These were the cheap, clever meals that filled stomachs and stories in kitchens where nothing ever went to waste. In the 1960s, packaging was more about durability and design than long-term safety, and nowhere was that more evident than in lead-based paint on food containers. Vibrant labels, eye-catching colors, and a sturdy finish made these containers look appealing on store shelves. But hidden beneath the surface was a toxic hazard. Lead-based paint, commonly used in everything from household walls to children's toys, also found its way onto food packaging, a decision that, in hindsight, was as dangerous as it sounds. At the time, lead's risks weren't fully understood by the general public. While scientists had long suspected its dangers, regulations were slow to catch up. The problem was that lead doesn't just stay on the surface. Over time, it can leach into food, especially acidic products like canned tomatoes. Consumers had no way of knowing that their favorite pantry staples might come with a side of neurotoxicity. The health risks were severe. Chronic exposure to lead can cause developmental issues in children, memory problems in adults, and even organ failure in extreme cases. As research mounted, the government stepped in. By the late 1970s, lead-based paints were banned from food-related products. Jell-O gelatin is a pretty tasty treat for an even better price for those who remember it. But did you know how many artificial sweeteners and harmful dyes were loaded in this one? If the past few names on the list were bad to you, then this might cause you to stop and think for a bit. A lot of additional stuff used in the gelatin, especially lots of food dyes for its various different flavors, were pretty harmful and caused skin issues as well as bloating, stomach discomfort, and nausea. With the way people consumed them, these otherwise lighter symptoms spiraled out to the point where, long-term, people's immune systems were going down the drain. This made them vulnerable to a lot more than just one specific type of health nightmare. Luckily, there was a push for gelatin products with no food dyes in the market, and brands like Kroger responded with new lines of Jell-O without all the worrisome fake stuff. Scrambled eggs had a massive makeover during the World War. It was a lot more common to add chopped parsley and chives to them rather than bacon and hash browns. Rationing efforts meant that a lot of basic ingredients were amiss, not just meat. While people were fighting over scraps of bacon, the sudden egg shortage really took them by surprise. Eggs were a pretty common breakfast, which I think is true of anywhere in the world. They were also a wonderful source of protein, so I'm sure you can figure out why the government wanted all the eggs to themselves. Dried, powdered eggs supplemented with water were used instead. You'd use the water and whisk them until they'd reach something that still resembled the texture of a fresh egg. Then, if you could afford to, you'd use some powdered milk to further make it resemble your typical plate of scrambled eggs. That raised another concern, which was, well, the powdered eggs are running out too fast. The solution people came up with at that point was to use fillers like vegetables, the parsley and chives, to fatten the egg up a bit. Make it a bit more substantial, you know? I have to say, I think they did a pretty clean job with it. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile, too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right. Those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available, no need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. You don't actually need to go to Shein for every shopping haul. It's so much more affordable to buy generic brands or local brands from designers and small businesses instead of overpriced thrifted articles that they've either gotten from some really questionable labor or what they've bought from the same people I'm talking about, but are now reselling at, like, thrice the price. It's a death trap. And I like you, viewer. I don't want you falling for it any more than you and I already have. Trust me, you'll still look just as good, if not better. Yes, you heard it here first, Skunk Stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten. Not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum. Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, It certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? Another delicacy that is native to West Africa is ackee fruit, which in Jamaica is a widely consumed treat and is even their national fruit, but in America is currently banned by the FDA. This is all because ackee fruit, as tasty and soft as it can be, contains hypoglycin, which is a toxin that can cause an allergic reaction you really would not see coming. Let's just say it feels like one of the worst hangovers of your life, and that may be why the sickness caused by ackee fruit has a name. In the world of medicine, it is lovingly referred to as Jamaican vomiting sickness, but do not let pretenses fool you. If too much of it is consumed when it is very ripe, the fruit can very well be fatal. Hence why there's such a tight ban on it. Enter the Gilbert U-238 Atomic Energy Laboratory, the pinnacle of educational toys with a twist of danger, available briefly before its discontinuation in 1952. Promising to unlock the mysteries of atomic energy for curious minds, this set included actual radioactive materials. Safety concerns quickly overshadowed its educational value as the potential for harmful exposure became apparent. This bold foray into hands-on science education left its mark as a cautionary tale of ambition outpacing safety, illustrating a pivotal moment in the evolution of consumer awareness and regulation. For much of the 20th century, canned meat was a pantry essential, affordable, long-lasting, and ready to eat. But hidden among the more familiar varieties was an ingredient that many consumers didn't realize they were eating: horse meat. While still consumed in some cultures today, its presence in canned foods was far more common in the past, especially in the 1960s, when it was used as a cheap filler in everything from stews to luncheon meat. At the time, labeling laws weren't as strict, and manufacturers weren't always transparent about what went into their products. If the can simply said beef or meat, there was no guarantee it wasn't something else. Horse meat was lean, high in protein, and, most importantly, cheaper than traditional livestock, making it an attractive option for food producers. And while it wasn't inherently unsafe to eat, the real problem came from contamination risks and unethical sourcing. As food safety regulations improved, so did scrutiny over meat processing. By the late 20th century, horse meat and canned goods became highly regulated or outright banned in many countries, including the US. Super Elastic Bubble Plastic was the stuff of legends, a whimsical toy that allowed children to create their own colorful, air-filled bubbles. Yet, beneath its vibrant allure lay hidden risks. The chemical composition of the plastic and the inhalation required to blow the bubbles raised health concerns, highlighting the complex balance between innovative play and safety. While captivating in its simplicity and creativity, Super Elastic Bubble Plastic's journey underscores the ongoing dialogue about the materials and methods used in toys, a conversation that continues to shape the landscape of play. Bushmeat, on the other hand, is something that carries a natural risk to it. No human interference needed this time. This is an umbrella term that refers to all kinds of animals caught in the wilds of Africa for daily sustenance. And when we say all kinds, please take that to heart. Bats, lions, as well as monkeys, literally nothing is off the table. These wild animals carry diseases with them. And during the Ebola outbreak from 2013 to 2016, governments started banning the hunting and consumption of bushmeat. It is still smuggled in illegally, though, and it goes for a pretty hefty price. So you might be surprised to hear Party Franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party Franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party Franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. Fish soufflé and baked potatoes were a wonderful combination, the kind of thing that just bounces off of the beach of its different parts and sides. The fish soufflé, along with a generous serving of baked potato, wasn't just delicious, it was also extremely nutritious. This was probably one of the recipes that kept up health the most throughout the whole ordeal. You might be wondering how fish was common enough for the recipe to have this kind of weight behind it. It just so happens that if you lived near a coastal city back then, you were definitely in luck, at least compared to the rest of the population. Fishing skyrocketed, not as a hobby this time, but as a necessary skill. Fish were plentiful, and most of all, they were free. They were the main source of nutrition for a lot of places. When people had no use for fish as food, they'd sell it to make some quick money and get whatever necessities they needed. Besides, it was common enough to get things like crab in the waters back then too. Stone soup is almost exactly what it sounds like, and it does involve a solid rock being in your soup. But hear us out, it is only temporary. Now, the origin of this term dates back to a European folktale about how 2 people would come into a town, convince everyone to share a bit of food, and then make a meal for the entire town. Sharing is caring, right? Anyway, the actual technique concerning food is to heat a rock in a fire and then place it in a bowl of soup so that it can cook it. People would add meat trimmings and scraps, plus carrots and cabbage to the soup to give it more nutritional value as well as flavor, and it did more or less work. What the real magic was that it browned the soup, which is something that you could not get in most standard soups people prepared. It also added a much richer flavor overall that was to die for, and people started to adopt the technique as it made soup on a budget much better than normal. Wasn't this a wonderful nostalgic journey through our grandmother's favorite recipes? Give us a like, subscribe, and let's keep those memories alive. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Repurposing old clothes helped a lot too. Lots of families would basically live off of hand-me-downs and reused clothes that needed a bit of work. They'd take a sweater, sew up the holes on it, trade a potato for some shoelaces, stuff like that. While of course today we get the privilege of not having to go that far, we can still take a page out of their book. Clothes are meant to be reused and worn again and again, and I'm sorry if TikTok brain rot has convinced you that you need to constantly update your wardrobe so you can serve looks every single time you step out. It's okay. Wear the black tee again. No one is going to care. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on. Especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Few chemical names have caused as much unnecessary panic as dihydrogen monoxide. Despite sounding like something from a lab experiment gone wrong, this so-called hazardous substance was, in reality, nothing more than water. The term became the centerpiece of a long-running joke, highlighting how scientific jargon could manipulate public perception. In an era when food safety concerns were growing, misinformation had the power to create fear, even over something as essential as water. The 1960s saw increasing scrutiny over food additives, preservatives, and chemical compounds in everyday products. With rising concerns about artificial ingredients, people became more wary of what they consumed. The dihydrogen monoxide hoax played into that anxiety, proving how a lack of understanding could turn a necessity into a perceived threat. The irony? Every person alarmed by its presence had already been consuming it their entire lives. Though water itself is harmless in moderation, it's technically possible to overdose on it, a rare but real condition called water intoxication, where excessive consumption disrupts the body's sodium levels. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, Bubble and Squeak really emphasized the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? Well-being of children. The Battlestar Galactica Colonial Viper missile toy, a marvel of the late 70s, brought the excitement of space battles to Earth. However, the small missile parts, designed to launch from the toy, became a source of grave concern following a choking incident that tragically ended in a child's death. This event in 1978 led to a swift recall and served as a critical lesson in the design and safety of toys with small detachable parts. It underscored the importance of foreseeing potential risks in toy design, ultimately influencing stricter safety standards and practices in the toy industry, ensuring that the imagination's flight does not come at the cost of safety, providing nutrients and keeping tummies full. When you think of popcorn, the Dust Bowl era is probably the last thing that comes to mind. Popcorn is the comfort food of the movie theaters, but believe it or not, they were still all the rage back in the 30s when options were limited. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. When milk was available, it was poured over freshly popped popcorn to turn the snack into a whole meal. Milk was scarce, so it wasn't always available, but when it was, this meal was everyone's go-to. Popcorn was a cheap and easily accessible grain, and milk, if you were lucky enough to have some, added a bit of protein and calcium. It might not be your first choice for a fancy dinner, but it was a clever way to make do with what was available. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane, where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. I think one of the worst money drainers of our generation is the lack of public transport. If it's not thousands of dollars spent back and forth on Uber, it's a lot of money and interest payments on leases for a car. Seriously, public transportation is amazing and is one of the best things about the modern world. You can get through an entire state in what? A few dollars? I mean, just look at how Japan does it. They have nothing but public transport, and they seem a lot happier. If you find yourself commuting often, then maybe you might want to look into more affordable ways of doing that. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy-flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store, if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. Scrapple is pretty common in Pennsylvania even today, but it started in the 1930s as a mush of pork trimmings with cornmeal or buckwheat and some minimal spices. Since people had limited options for their culinary ventures, most scrapple were not as tasty as they could have been. That does not mean it lacked a kick, though, as most people found that even for trimmings, it worked pretty amazingly overall. People would regularly make it a habit to ask their butcher to save any scraps that were left over or unused because they had some scrapple in mind for today's menu. Especially in the Mid-Atlantic in places like Virginia, Delaware, Washington, and South Jersey. People would use offal too and make a broth out of the bones, though in the end any bones and fat were taken out of the dish. We've got one thing straight, meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well, but when done right, it was totally worth it. A pretty imaginative way of getting some familiar old flavors back into the weekly diet was mock food, specifically mock fish fillets. We're going to take a look this time at both this recipe and how exactly things like it became common. See, there's one thing about people from back then. While they definitely had it horrible, their circumstances really expanded their horizons in the kitchen. Mock culture was all about mimicking flavors of classic dishes with inexpensive ingredients. Stuff that was easy to get, wouldn't cut too deep into your pockets, and would also last you a good while. Mock fish fillets were actually made out of mashed potatoes. I really wasn't kidding when I said people really grew a newfound appreciation for potatoes. Recipes in cookbooks back then were using them in ways that the curly fries and hash brown-addled brains of you and I could only dream of. Still, there were times when even potatoes weren't available. In that case, they'd make use of bread. Now, you might naturally be wondering how bread even comes close to imitating the flavor of a fish fillet. Well, apparently, soaking it in some milk and mixing it with powdered eggs and flour actually forms a mixture that gets the texture down. Next, your spices. Onion, parsley, pepper, and some pretty basic stuff, which was still easy enough to get. Though even those were stretched thin, spice cabinets would often run empty. Do you think this actually does the job? If you try it, share what you thought in the comments below. Super Elastic Bubble Plastic was the stuff of legends, a whimsical toy that allowed children to create their own colorful, air-filled bubbles. Yet, beneath its vibrant allure lay hidden risks. The chemical composition of the plastic and the inhalation required to blow the bubbles raised health concerns, highlighting the complex balance between innovative play and safety. While captivating in its simplicity and creativity, Super Elastic Bubble Plastic's journey underscores the ongoing dialogue about the materials and methods used in toys, a conversation that continues to shape the landscape of play. Curious minds might raise an eyebrow at the idea that, during the 1960s, individuals resorted to an unlikely source of nourishment: canned dog food. A few families saw it as a last resort in times of hardship. Far from modern-day grocery aisles brimming with processed dinners, resources could be so thin that this canine cuisine found its way onto human plates. Officials often overlooked the contents, leaving potential bacterial hazards unchecked, which wasn't a 5-star guarantee of safety. Surprisingly, there was minimal pushback from authorities regarding its distribution. Without modern health inspections, contamination occasionally slipped by, raising concerns about sanitation and disease. Despite these risks, The product's easy availability attracted desperate shoppers who discovered it was cheaper than most meat options. That affordability turned it into a peculiar standby, although tastiness was sometimes questionable at best. Regulations were not particularly strict back then, so certain labels didn't specify the exact ingredients lurking within each can. Reflecting on that era reveals a culture willing to stretch a dollar when the cupboard ran bare. Clackers, those captivating orbs that danced a dangerous ballet in the hands of daring youngsters. Introduced to America's playgrounds in the swinging 60s, these simple toys of two balls connected by a string captivated many with their hypnotic clacking. Yet, this seemingly innocent pastime harbored a hidden peril. By the 1970s, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration stepped in, raising alarms over the toy's shattering risk. The hard acrylic could break, launching sharp shards into the air, a clear danger to any child's face or eyes. Thus, amid concerns and injuries, clackers were subjected to stringent safety regulations, forever changing their presence in the hands of American youth. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. One thing you might have heard a lot during the Depression was how bartering made a strong comeback. That's not wrong at all, and it actually applies even more today. So let's say some of these tips on the list aren't up your alley. Maybe your fashion is really important to you and you can't handle reusing old clothes you need to patch up. I get it. Self-expression is neat. Maybe you really rely on comfort food or don't have the space to start your own backyard garden. All fair concerns. In that case, why not barter? Trade things or services you don't have a need for, can offer in your free time, either for something you need in return or for a bit of loose change. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. Rolled flank steak was a much less expensive cut of beef. A lot of protein like fish and canned ham were used, but people couldn't really replace the need for beef. Of course, they had to make do. But that meant another thing. Less popular cuts of meat, ones that people normally wouldn't give a second glance to, became a lot more in demand. Naturally, you'd think that would mean they'd raise the prices, right? Not really, because then people would just buy the beef. Flank steak in particular was tougher and a lot more rubbery, but it was also really tender when you would slow cook it. It also helped matters that most home chefs knew their way pretty intimately around slow cooking. Next, you'd do whatever you could to make sure that the beef would last as long as possible. It was usually common to serve rolled flank steak with stuffing to make a pretty neat dish that required minimal beef. The stuffing itself was made from economy loaves, vegetables, and different kinds of herbs. An otherwise small and pretty hard-to-chew piece of meat would become a meal the whole family could look forward to, if you were willing to invest the hours it would take to make something of it. Most people were just happy to eat beef, though, which made the prep work just a bit more bearable.
Then, the tale of the Cabbage Patch Kids Snack Time Kids dolls, a late 90s sensation, brings a modern twist to our nostalgic journey. These dolls, designed to eat snacks fed by their young owners, captured hearts until an unforeseen hazard emerged. The mechanism that enabled this unique feature also posed a risk of entangling children's fingers and hair, leading to a recall in 1997. This incident highlights the ongoing challenges faced by toy manufacturers and regulators in ensuring the safety of innovative toys, a reminder of the delicate balance between creativity and caution in the world of children's playthings.
In an era defined by boundless optimism and experimental remedies, a curious tonic emerged: Radithor, or radioactive water. During a time when scientific breakthroughs were celebrated without the benefit of modern safety protocols, this radium-infused elixir was marketed as a miracle drink, promising renewed vitality. Companies boldly touted its rejuvenating properties while food safety oversight was in its infancy, and regulations lagged behind the fervor for innovation. Although endorsements by well-known figures lent it credibility, users eventually discovered that regular consumption led to severe health risks, including bone decay and radiation poisoning, a grim reminder that not every scientific experiment was a step forward. Intriguingly, advertisements depicted Radithor as a fountain of youth in a bottle, a claim that today would undoubtedly trigger public outcry rather than applause. Its popularity stemmed from the era's trust in emerging technologies and a willingness to embrace unconventional treatments during uncertain times. The tale of Radithor serves as a compelling chapter in our culinary and pharmaceutical history, highlighting a period when progress sometimes outpaced prudence.
The Austin Magic Pistol, a toy of the 1950s, exemplifies America's post-war innovation and the era's relaxed approach to safety, distinguished by its use of magic crystals that, when combined with water, propelled a plastic ball with a bang. This toy captured the imagination of many a young sharpshooter. However, its operation, essentially a controlled explosion, raised eyebrows. Classified as a firearm in numerous states today, the Austin Magic Pistol's fall from grace reflects a growing awareness of the need for stringent safety measures in children's playthings, a sign of changing times in American society.
Cherry tomato salads are pretty much just a really refreshing way to utilize your tomatoes. Thanks to Victory Gardens, which was a concept that spread like wildfire, all sorts of people were getting first-hand farming experience. When you get into that sort of thing, you soon realize the prestige of a tomato. It's one of the heaviest hitters when it comes to fruits. If you think I'm overrating it, well, I won't bore you with all the benefits of a tomato, but I will let you in on how easy they are to grow. These things can be grown from February to mid-March outdoors or indoors, in the ground or in a pot. This made them perfect for Victory Gardens. But tomatoes on their own aren't something you can do a lot with. That's where cherry tomato salads come in. This was a light-hearted, refreshing salad that really put some energy back into you, and it was pretty needed too. After a long day of working in subpar environments and just constantly being in bad living conditions, people's bodies really needed a good salad to jolt them awake. Plus, it always made for a wonderful breakfast. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but Hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, the leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available, things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty, or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. Doing your own repairs at home was also always an amazing idea. This is still something guys are taught to do from a really young age, like their teenage years or something, but I say, why keep it to 1/2 of the population? Everyone should know how to fix basic issues at home. A leaky pipe, a broken mirror, a sink that's clogged. Are these things you need to hire the costly services of a professional for? No. We have one thing that people in the 1930s didn't, and that's YouTube, and I say we exploit it where we can. Olestra was born out of the 1960s drive to reinvent everyday food. This fat substitute promised guilt-free indulgence without the extra calories. Its introduction coincided with a time when scientific optimism often outpaced regulatory oversight. As the industry celebrated a marvel of chemical engineering, food safety protocols were only just beginning to catch up, leaving a gap that allowed unanticipated health concerns to emerge. Consumers embraced Olestra for its novelty and promise of a lighter future, even as emerging reports hinted at severe gastrointestinal distress. Laboratory findings eventually revealed that, while free of traditional fat calories, this compound could disrupt the absorption of essential vitamins and cause digestive discomfort. This paradox, a product engineered to aid dietary goals that ultimately compromised nutritional well-being, became a cautionary tale in modern food history. Interestingly, advertisements once lauded Olestra as the solution for those seeking to enjoy their favorite snacks without compromise. However, as adverse effects accumulated, both scientists and regulators pushed for tighter safety measures, marking a significant turning point in food additive scrutiny. Split pea soup was always something that we enjoyed greatly, mostly thanks to our European neighbors in the States. They didn't become a nationwide sensation until the Depression and World War II hit, though. That entire period actually saw an insane spike in the general perception of beans, peas, and lentils. Basically, anything that was vaguely similar to that was suddenly God's greatest gift to Earth. This doesn't just have to do with the times being hard and there being a massive war going on either. It has to do, again, with some age-old state-backed peer pressure. A lot of people were lost in the face of rations and surpluses that just didn't make the cut or last very long. The tensions with the government were extraordinarily high, especially with a lot of people just being tired of the war effort. The government of the United States of America decided to encourage people to cultivate some new hobbies in these trying times. One of those happens to be foraging, and it was just as convenient as it sounds. Free food that you can gather right from nature itself, that no one has to pay for? You can definitely see why something like that went mainstream. What's not to love about a 3-ingredient delicious sauce? White sauce was the comforting meal you look forward to coming home to every night. It was a break from the bland foods of the dirty 30s, and the best part? It required just 3 common ingredients that were already staples in everyone's kitchen: flour, butter, and milk. This sauce is like an easy breezy addition of the bechamel sauce, which is one of the mother sauces of French cuisine. This sauce is made from a white roux and milk, seasoned with ground nutmeg. Since we didn't have fancy ingredients on hand, the simple ones did the job. This sauce was used to top pasta, vegetables, casseroles, and even lasagnas. If you were lucky enough to have a bit of cheese in your pantry, it could be turned into a cheesy sauce. If you had some herbs, it could be seasoned to add extra flavor. And let's be honest, in tough times, a little creamy sauce can make everything taste just a bit better. Bread pudding has been a subject of much discussion in the history books of our developments with food. It would be a bit of an undersell to call it polarizing, since some people claim it is the ultimate comfort food, and there simply is not anything like it. Others think it is an affront to the concept of bread and pudding simultaneously, and fails to really capture the benefits of either. Still, the makeshift recipes from the 1930s were worth trying then, and are still worth trying now, as they put bread pudding on the map and helped it stay there. It was a great way to repurpose leftover stale bread, And despite its record as the poor man's pudding, it was a common recipe in church cookbooks even before the recession hit. All you had to do was get some boiling water, sugar, spices, and bread. And sure, it was not the most appealing or appetizing lump of dough to eat, but it got you through the day, and in times of extreme scarcity, who could ask for more? If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. In the times that were the Depression, there was a dire lack of oil and cooking fat. This meant that the already really tough cuts of meat that people were using, like the shoulders or the back, were even harder to chew and keep down every other day since there was no fat to help them with flavor. On the other hand, people would try to get around this issue by using as much leftover bacon grease as they could. Maybe that's a bit icky for you, but hey, it does help. Plus, they were a lot healthier than we were, so maybe the icks are coming from inside the house. A household staple for decades, canned tuna was a go-to choice for quick meals and affordable protein. Packed with convenience and a mild flavor that fit everything from sandwiches to casseroles, its popularity surged throughout the 20th century. But hidden beneath its silver lid was an ingredient no one had bargained for: mercury. Some brands of tuna contained alarmingly high levels of the toxic metal, a risk that went largely unnoticed in the 1960s when food safety regulations had yet to catch up with modern science. Back then, concerns over contaminants weren't front-page news. The average consumer had little reason to suspect that a simple tuna salad might come with a side of neurological damage. Mercury, a heavy metal that can accumulate in the body, posed serious health risks, especially for pregnant women and young children. Symptoms of mercury poisoning included cognitive impairments, muscle weakness, and developmental issues, hardly what anyone expected from a lunchtime staple. As research progressed, regulatory agencies stepped in. By the 1970s, the FDA began imposing stricter limits on mercury levels in seafood, and today, guidelines recommend limiting the consumption of certain fish. Beef barley soup is but a humble dish that comes right from tales of peasant wives making hearty breakfasts for their families. Sorry for sounding like a Lord of the Rings extra for a second. Really though, beef barley soup is as vintage as a recipe can get. Barley itself is one of the most ancient grains we have, not just in the States, but all across the world. Again, the idea of pairing it with beef is something we took from our European buddies that immigrated to Uncle Sam's greener pastures. When they weren't looking so green, and trust me, the 1930s and 40s were a long time, it was in everyone's mutual interest to play it smart. By that I mean there was a lot of inspiration to take from all the different communities around in the States. What is America if not a melting pot of different cultures? Beef barley soup used a lot less meat than the recipe typically calls for, but the substitute of roasted vegetables really brought it all together in a wonderful way. It was now not just a peasant dish for field workers, but something everyone had daily, because it was the best they could get.
The Easy Bake Oven, a beloved toy since 1963, found itself under scrutiny in 2007. Known for allowing children to craft their own culinary creations, this seemingly harmless device led to an unexpected danger. Reports of children getting their fingers stuck, with some cases resulting in burns severe enough to necessitate surgery, prompted a massive recall of approximately 1 million units. This incident served as a stark reminder of the evolving understanding of toy safety, leading to a redesigned Easy Bake Oven that prioritized accessibility and safety, ensuring that future chefs could bake without fear. The Easy Bake Oven, a beloved toy since 1963, found itself under scrutiny in 2007. Known for allowing children to craft their own culinary creations, this seemingly harmless device led to an unexpected danger. Reports of children getting their fingers stuck, with some cases resulting in burns severe enough to necessitate surgery, prompted a massive recall of approximately 1 million units. This incident served as a stark reminder of the evolving understanding of toy safety, leading to a redesigned Easy Bake Oven that prioritized accessibility and safety, ensuring that future chefs could bake without fear.
Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it. A perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seemed to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy-flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. Another thing that people always did was prepare their own homemade snacks. People would make granola bars at home or bake their own little potato chips and corn chips, and it was actually such a nice thing to do because you wouldn't have to take out so much money for literally just 2 or 3 bites of a snack. Plus, these days, snacks cost as much as an outside meal from a restaurant does. It's actually a little insane, you know? Do you know what a jar of Nutella costs nowadays? Isn't it so much easier to just bake some cookies at home and call it a day? Processed meats have long been a fixture of the American diet, offering convenience, affordability, and a satisfying smoky flavor. But there was one key ingredient that made these meats last longer and look more appetizing: sodium nitrate. In the 1960s, it was used liberally in everything from bacon to hot dogs, ensuring bright red hues and extended shelf life. Few questioned what made their deli meat so vibrant, but as science advanced, concerns began to emerge. At the time, food preservation was a priority, and sodium nitrate was seen as a practical solution. It prevented bacterial growth and gave processed meats a signature cured taste. However, researchers later discovered a darker side. When exposed to high heat, sodium nitrate could form nitrosamines, compounds linked to cancer in animal studies. While a single ham sandwich wasn't a cause for alarm, A lifetime of consuming highly processed meats raised significant health concerns. By the 1970s, regulatory agencies stepped in, limiting nitrate levels and requiring careful monitoring. While still legal today in controlled amounts, many consumers now seek nitrate-free options. The story of sodium nitrate serves as a reminder that food science is constantly evolving. The next best thing to do is to turn off lights whenever you leave rooms. The dark isn't that bad, and you really don't need to have a light on in a room that's on the other end of the house just for appearance. I mean, it's not like anyone's there. Who do you even have it on for? Definitely not yourself, but let me tell you who really doesn't want you to turn it off. Your electricity provider, and every second you spend on the ambiance of your house, they're giggling over your rising bill.
Barbie Rollerblade, a toy that sparkled with the promise of fun, took a sharp turn towards safety concerns in 1992. These dolls, equipped with rollerblades that emitted real sparks, captured the imagination of many until the potential fire hazard they posed came to light. The recall of Barbie rollerblade skates underscored the complexities of integrating dynamic features into toys and the paramount importance of thorough safety testing. This incident not only highlighted the challenges of innovation in toy design, but also reinforced the enduring commitment to safeguarding the joy and well-being of children.
Lima bean soup is a little different. See, they wanted to scoop up all the grade A stuff, the easy sources of protein. I mean, you'd be pretty right in thinking that includes beans too, and yeah, lots of soldiers ate canned beans and soups made out of various beans. Luckily for everyone, there was, for once, just once during the war, enough to go around most of the country. Lima beans in particular were really popular throughout the Midwest and the South. Let me talk a little about what wartime cooking did for soups, though. While they were never really hurting for love or attention, you couldn't exactly call a bowl of soup the main attraction. Maybe today, in gourmet dining circles, that kind of thing could fly, but back then, there wasn't enough value for money. That quickly changed once people realized soups are actually a lot better all around when you make them at home. I'm not talking about taste, since that was still something people took time to get used to. I'm talking about utility. A soup can be readjusted so many times. It takes literally nothing but water as a base to make, and it can go around an entire large family. That's the kind of thing you hold on to tight during an economic breakdown, and nothing shows that better than Lima bean soup. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the Dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. Egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread. If you believe that eating insects is a modern sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. Now, if you think baking a cake without eggs, milk, or butter sounds impossible, think again. During the Dust Bowl, people got creative with their baking. This egg-free, milk-free, and butter-free cake was made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, and vegetable oil. It was impossible to live without cake even in times of desperation, so people decided to make do without the fancy ingredients. Now, I know eggs, milk, and butter don't sound fancy to us, but these ingredients were a luxury to find during the Dust Bowl days, and even if you did find some, it was never enough to whip up a whole cake. The cake might not have been as rich as its traditional counterparts, but it was a sweet treat that offered a bit of comfort during difficult times. Supper sub. Avocado toast? That's not what life was like during the Dust Bowl. People were eating cactus fruit and spreading lard. Now you might be wondering, what on earth is a cactus fruit? Well, think of it as nature's candy. These spiny little fruits, also called cactus pears or prickly pears, were produced by cacti and turned into an important staple during the worst days of the Dust Bowl. These spiny wonders would be gathered, skinned, and the sweet and sour pulp could be eaten. Now here's where things get interesting. They didn't just eat cactus fruit by itself. No, sir. Farmers needed to add more substance to it, and that's where lard comes in. Lard, the rendered pig fat that many farm families kept in their pantry. So, they would beat the cactus fruit with a generous dollop of lard, and they could spread it on bread, crackers, or anything that was eatable at that time. It wasn't fancy, but it fed people. Well, yes, it might sound a little strange now, but cactus fruit contained vitamins and water, which was scarce. Well, it goes without saying that where there is a will, there is a way. And this combo is a perfect example of that. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. Yes, you heard it here first, Skunk Stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten, not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum. Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally.
Next, let's recall the Creepy Crawler's Thing Maker, an innovation that turned the ordinary American kitchen into a mini monster factory. Launched in the 1960s, this device allowed children to create a plethora of rubbery creatures from heated plastic. However, its very design, featuring an open heating element, posed a significant risk. Burns became a troubling consequence for unsuspecting young creators, leading to a redesign aimed at ensuring safety. Despite its enthralling promise of endless fun, the Thingmaker's hazardous potential marked a pivotal moment in the evaluation of toy safety standards during that era.
By the mid-20th century, the pursuit of guilt-free sweetness was in full swing. Sugar alternatives promised all the flavor with none of the calories, and few artificial sweeteners were as widely embraced as saccharin. First discovered in the late 1800s, it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that it became a staple in diet sodas, processed foods, and even table sweeteners. With no clear regulations on its long-term effects, it was marketed as the perfect solution for those looking to cut sugar without sacrificing taste. But what seemed like a miracle ingredient soon came under scrutiny. Early animal studies linked saccharin to bladder cancer in lab rats, triggering widespread concern. While the findings weren't immediately confirmed in humans, the idea of a potentially carcinogenic sweetener sitting in coffee cups across the country was enough to prompt action. By the late 1970s, the FDA required warning labels on products containing saccharin, and in some places, bans followed. Further research eventually led to a reversal of some of those restrictions, but the damage to saccharin's reputation was done. Today, it's still used in limited capacities, though consumers have largely moved on to other artificial sweeteners. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s, though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put two and two together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. You may think of weed as something you don't want in your garden, but during the Dust Bowl, it was the only thing that could keep people alive. Weed and root stew was another dish that families who were surviving on the edge of starvation could afford, which meant even the most unappetizing plants could save lives. This stew was full of wild greens, dandelions, lamb's quarters, purslane, things you dig up in the garden with your fingers. The stew was not gourmet, but it was filling. The weeds and roots were boiled in water with whatever scrap of meat or bone one could come across. A piece of chicken that had been used the previous day or some beef if one were lucky. The trick was to make it filling, and wild greens can do that. The taste was not gourmet, but hearty. It would not be a restaurant of the stars, but a restaurant of the gut. The roots were sometimes starchy, which was good enough for making a soup. Although calling it weed might not exactly make your mouth water today, wild plants were a great source of vitamins and minerals, much more than that yellowing lettuce in the back of the fridge. Would I eat it? Frankly, if I were in the Dust Bowl, I'd take that weed stew and turn it into my gourmet dish. It is evidence that when it comes to seasoning, desperation is the best thing. People also used to make their own makeshift DIY cleaning products out of baking soda and vinegar. If you have a cat, you might actually be familiar with this if you've ever dealt with their awful bladder control. Turns out, the two together actually make for a pretty decent detergent, and if you ever find yourself out of some cleaning products or just don't feel like going to the store and you can't order, it's always good to make some at home. It helps you save just a little bit more on the groceries while teaching you a resourceful little skill. This next one is sautéed liver with tomato sauce. Okay, I get it. No one's that big of a fan of liver. I wouldn't blame you because, to be honest, I can't really get with it either. Actually, the government wouldn't blame you either, because they're the same. Not sure what I mean? Rationing efforts were actually decided by what seems to be a group of picky eaters. Remember how, when we were talking about rolled flank steak, we went over the fact that it was a less popular cut of meat? That was true for like a million other things. Rationing efforts focused most on premium cuts of meat, fresh produce, and popular vegetables. The stuff that wasn't so up to quality was left behind for the people. I guess it kind of makes sense, but also, wouldn't you be happy to get whatever meat you could during a war? That's definitely how the people back at home felt. Thanks to all of this, liver became insanely more popular. A lot of people realized the health benefits of it and how nutritious it was, and began using it in their daily diet. I guess you really can acquire any taste. Would you give liver a fair shot today? Or is that a little past our comfort zone?
Barbie Rollerblade, a toy that sparkled with the promise of fun, took a sharp turn towards safety concerns in 1992. These dolls, equipped with rollerblades that emitted real sparks, captured the imagination of many until the potential fire hazard they posed came to light. The recall of Barbie rollerblade skates underscored the complexities of integrating dynamic features into toys and the paramount importance of thorough safety testing. This incident not only highlighted the challenges of innovation in toy design, but also reinforced the enduring commitment to safeguarding the joy and well-being.
In the mid-20th century, the agricultural industry was on a mission to maximize production, and antibiotics played a key role in that effort. One in particular, chloramphenicol, became a popular choice for keeping livestock healthy and increasing meat yields. Farmers saw it as an efficient way to prevent infections in crowded conditions, while food producers benefited from higher output. For a time, it seemed like a win-win until scientists uncovered the serious health risks lurking beneath the surface. Unlike some antibiotics that merely disrupt digestion, chloramphenicol posed a far more alarming danger: aplastic anemia, a rare but potentially fatal condition where the body stops producing enough blood cells. The problem wasn't just with direct exposure. Traces of the antibiotic could linger in meat and dairy products, making their way onto dinner tables across the country. Consumers had no way of knowing that their Sunday roast might come with a side of medical complications. As evidence mounted, regulators took action. By the 1980s, chloramphenicol was banned in food production in many countries, including the United States. Today, strict testing ensures that no remnants make it into the food supply. I really mean it when I say they didn't let anything go to waste. You might shiver at the thought of hot braised beef tongue, but back then, it was a proper delicacy. I'm serious. Forget tongue, they even ate cow brains. Beef tongue was pretty much a staple of homemade cooking during the wartime and the Depression. If you thought being resourceful meant eating one more fruit a day and mixing some veggies in, this is going to show you just how serious it actually was for people. Organ meats were really in high demand for a particular reason. They weren't rationed, and if they were, then the state's grip on it wasn't half as tight. Obviously, right? Tongues aren't notorious for their easy handling or how convenient they are to prepare. Instead, the government thought about killing two birds with one tongue and promoted the use of organ meats even further. This otherwise really tough slab of meat was made super soft, tender enough that it was familiar to the American palate via braising. Now, that had a trade-off. It meant that you had to slow cook this for a majority of the day. That's why braised beef tongues weren't a daily dish, but they were definitely regular enough. Luckily, not every community in America saw this as a shock. Latin American and Jewish communities were pretty used to eating beef tongue, and even Muslim ones pitched in with their best recipes and tricks. One thing about the 30s and 40s is that they had a communal spirit way above whatever we have today. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. And the garden was dust. You made rag soup. Well, they did not boil actual rags, praise heavens, but because this soup was made from the scraps so lowly that it was like throwing rags into a pot. Rag soup was made from water, a couple of carrots, or any other vegetable that was left rotten and, at most, a piece of meat or a bone if one were to be lucky. It was thin, hardly spiced, and was stretched to go around the whole family. You can consider it as the soup where the idea is more important than the substance. The beauty of rag soup was that it was a very versatile dish. Got a carrot and a potato? In they go. Found a pinch of salt? Jackpot. It was a meal that was prepared in a time of famine and at the same time creativity. And though it was simple, it gave heat and food during the worst conditions. Rag soup is evidence of the fact that Dust Bowl families were able to survive and cook something tasty even out of the scraps. Carrot tops, the lost greens that were anything but lost during the Dust Bowl. When fresh vegetables were out of season, nothing was thrown away, not even the green tops of carrots. Carrot top salad made these usually discarded greens into a rather healthy meal. The greens were chopped, dressed with vinegar or lemon juice, and combined with any leftovers of vegetables or wild greens that could be found. If you were really fancy, you might add some more olive oil or a dash of salt. The result? A sharp, sour dish that was anything but luxurious, but was instead a nutritionist's dream. Carrot tops have a robust, somewhat pungent taste, so they are considered a luxury item in today's terms. However, as they say, when the going gets tough, the tough get eating, and Dust Bowl families were certainly tough. Fun fact, carrot tops are not only edible, but also rich in nutrients such as vitamin K and other vitamins and minerals. I'd like to try this salad, perhaps, if there is enough dressing to offset the bitterness. It is not something I would run for, but I do appreciate the creativity of using leftovers to get food. If there is one thing that the Dust Bowl did, it showed that although survival may not always be pretty, it is always impressive. If you limit your meat consumption like people did back then, you'll find yourself saving a lot of money. You have to think about it like this. Would you, as you are today, or would the people we know today survive the Depression? No. People back then were the very definition of frugal, and they knew how to stretch the life out of every single dollar in grocery. Limiting meat consumption meant that people were saving more not just on food, but also on medical expenses, since they were getting healthier and stronger immune systems at the same time too. It's literally two massive money-sucking birds with one serving of celery. Have you ever come across those roadkill signs by the side of the road? Well, some people, especially during the Dust Bowl, benefited from those poor animals. Yes, canned roadkill was a grim but feasible way to feed many destitute farmers out there. You didn't have a butcher or a grocery store. If you saw something fresh on the side of the road, you didn't waste it. Farmers would gather up whatever animals had been hit by cars, squirrels, rabbits, even deer, and can them for future consumption. The process was basic. You'd gut and prepare the animal, put it in a can, and then close the lid. It might sound like something out of a horror movie today, but it was a real source for survival. The meat was loaded with protein and could be stored for long periods of time. Canned roadkill was not a gourmet dish, but it meant that people would not starve to death. Now, I know most people will say they'd rather die than eat roadkill, but honestly, if it were the difference between dying and living, I'd probably be the first one in line for canned rabbit stew. You do what you gotta do. Of all the risky delicacies in food history, few come with stakes as high as canned puffer fish. Revered for its delicate taste, yet feared for its lethal potential, this fish contains tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin so potent that a dose smaller than a pinhead can cause paralysis and death. Today, only highly trained chefs are allowed to prepare it, but in the past, access was far less controlled. In unregulated markets, improperly prepared fugu was available in cans, turning a simple meal into a gamble with survival. The appeal of fugu wasn't just about flavor, it was about thrill. For some, eating it was a status symbol, a culinary daredevil act that proved one's bravery. But unlike most food-related risks, this one didn't end with an upset stomach. There's no antidote for tetrodotoxin, meaning a mistake in preparation could be fatal. Yet, regulations in the 1960s weren't nearly as strict as they are today, and canned versions were sold in some markets without the careful oversight now required. As reports of poisoning surfaced, authorities clamped down. Many countries banned unregulated sales, limiting its preparation to certified chefs.
The Water Wiggle by Wham-O, a seemingly innocuous garden hose attachment, promised endless summer fun with its erratic, water-spraying antics. Yet, beneath its playful exterior lurked hidden dangers. In the 1970s, the toy was linked to accidents and injuries, leading to its withdrawal from the market. The Water Wiggle's journey from backyard favorite to safety cautionary tale underscores the critical importance of evaluating playthings for all potential risks, not just those apparent at first glance. This episode in toy history serves as a reminder of the evolving standards of safety that guide the industry, ensuring that the laughter of children playing with water is not overshadowed by preventable hazards.
Wartime living during World War II really shows you how much people worked with so little. During the war, butter and margarine were rationed pretty extensively too. That basically meant your local diet had a big void where fats should be, and that wasn't good for anyone. You'd need that stuff to cook or bake and just to get on with your week. Dripping was people's easy, one-stop solution to this crisis. When you'd roast meat, you'd get drippings from it. This wasn't just used once, but again and again as many times as possible. Pork or beef fat is another term for dripping, and it's still used in places today. But during the war, every home was working like this. There was such a strong mentality of not letting even a single part of an animal go to waste, and that didn't just include the meat and bones, but also the fat. I guess it's pretty admirable how much the brain can think of when you find yourself in situations like this. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. Have you ever heard of using cloth napkins and towels? They might not feel as good as the paper products we're used to and have been familiar with since the, start of our lives, but they do save a pretty penny. The thing is, all of this is a lifestyle choice. These little tips and tricks on their own might not add too much, but you buy the cloth napkin, You make the snack at home, you make a DIY detergent, and you start to see enough money bubbling up in your account at month's end. Eventually. Onions are one of the most common ingredients in many dishes, but during the Dust Bowl, nothing was wasted, not even the outer skin of the onions. I might have thought baked onion skins were something I would throw in the garbage disposal today, but they were a delicacy back then. Farmers would save the skins of the onions used in preparing dinner and then roast them with a pinch of salt and oil, and they turned out delicious. The skins, after roasting, became a sort of a chip. Well, it did not taste like the real onion ring that we have today, but it was crispy, salty, and made of ingredients that were easily obtainable, or, as we would call it today, the Dust Bowl version of a chip snack. Onions were fairly affordable, and it was a good way not to waste anything since they were simple to cultivate. Besides, they were full of antioxidants and other nutrients that could compensate for the absence of other more healthy foods. If baked onion skins were good enough to sustain life, they might be good enough for me. Now let's take a little bit of a break from otherwise uncomfortable areas of a cow and go on over to calico scrambled eggs. Not sure what I mean? Calico scrambled eggs were named that pretty much because they were really vibrant and colorful. It was tough to get fresh white or brown eggs because there was just too much of a need on the front lines for them. The war effort could still spare some powdered eggs, though even that had to be stretched. Adding some basic leftover scraps like herbs and vegetables really helped make it last long, but it was the Victory Gardens that helped the most. A lot of the stuff that you typically see in calico scrambled eggs came right out of a Victory Garden. Bell peppers, onions, potatoes, tomatoes, and even spinach. People really discovered their green thumb during this time period. These weren't just filling, they were comforting and nutritious too. Most food during wartime just didn't consider presentability at all. I mean, no shade to them, it wouldn't even be appropriate to. Still, who can deny that your food tastes a little nicer when it looks pretty too? These scrambled eggs helped people remember the fun of eating a good-looking plate, but didn't really require any kind of time or work spent preparing it, which was really one of the best things about them.
The Easy Bake Oven, a beloved toy since 1963, found itself under scrutiny in 2007. Known for allowing children to craft their own culinary creations, this seemingly harmless device led to an unexpected danger. Reports of children getting their fingers stuck, with some cases resulting in burns severe enough to necessitate surgery, prompted a massive recall of approximately 1 million units. This incident served as a stark reminder of the evolving understanding of toy safety, leading to a redesigned Easy Bake Oven that prioritized accessibility and safety, ensuring that future chefs could bake without fear.
Seafood has long been praised as a healthy, protein-rich option, but in the 1960s, some portions came with an unexpected side effect: mercury exposure. As industrial pollution increased, heavy metals made their way into oceans and rivers, accumulating in fish that millions consumed daily. At the time, awareness of mercury's dangers was limited, and food regulations had yet to impose strict monitoring. Consumers enjoyed their seafood dinners unaware that certain species carried levels of the toxic element high enough to pose serious health risks. Mercury is particularly insidious because it builds up in the body over time. While a single meal wouldn't cause immediate harm, consistent exposure could lead to neurological damage, developmental issues in children, and even kidney failure. Pregnant women were at the highest risk, as mercury could interfere with fetal brain development. Yet, in the mid-century push for convenience and affordability, few questioned what lurked beneath the surface of their favorite fish dishes. It wasn't until the 1970s, after growing scientific research and public outcry, that regulatory agencies like the FDA established strict mercury limits in seafood.
The saga of lawn darts, or jarts, as they were colloquially known, is a somber chapter in toy history. Introduced in the 1960s, these metal-tipped darts, intended for outdoor play, soon revealed a darker side. After causing numerous injuries and tragically fatalities, lawn darts were banned in 1988 in the United States. This ban served as a watershed moment in toy safety, illustrating the critical need for oversight and regulation in children's playthings. The story of lawn darts remains a powerful reminder of the responsibilities manufacturers and regulators bear in ensuring the well-being of young enthusiasts.
Pimento cheese spreads were creamy, tangy, and just about the savior that America needed. One thing that's consistent throughout American history is the country's extreme love of cheese. That just doesn't change. Pick any century, and you'll find cheese addicts across every state, which is why the shortages of dairy and cheese really hurt people a lot during the Depression and World War. It wasn't as if a source of fat just vanished. It was like a best friend went away to another country. Imagine if people took cheese out of your diet today. Not a fun scenario, right? Pimento cheese spreads were pretty much the holy grail of wartime cooking because of this. It started when mass-produced cream cheese really started to become a thing and began to use pimentos in it. This was somewhere around the early 1900s, but in the World War, the general recipe got revealed to the public. Now, obviously, people weren't in a position to get cream cheese, but sometimes, on a lucky break, they'd have some cheddar lying around. Pimento cheese spreads were made using that, and they became the lifeline of all kinds of people. Factory workers, students at school, families, rural class neighborhoods. Any sort of community or group you can imagine, I bet they had some fond memories with pimento cheese. Remember when I said cornmeal was dirt cheap during the Dust Bowl era? Plus, it was almost everywhere, especially if you lived in Missouri or Kansas. Well, cornmeal mush was something Meemaw made every time we needed a nice, fulfilling meal. Think of it as the instant oatmeal of the Dust Bowl days. You just cooked cornmeal in water until it reached a thick, porridge-like consistency. It was often served with a pat of butter or a sprinkle of sugar. Some folks even added a little molasses for extra flavor. Cornmeal mush was an affordable way to keep hunger at bay and provided a good source of energy. It wasn't a five-star meal, but it was dependable, much like the comfort of a warm blanket on a cold night. Meats and chicken were too expensive, so people had to make do with veggies like corn. Imagine a meal that's as simple as it sounds. Cooked the flour in water and made dumplings. Now, I know you're wondering, that sounds like something you'd make on a sad Tuesday when you have nothing else in the pantry. Well, you're not wrong, but during the Dust Bowl, this was a hearty way to fill up a family when food was so scarce that even the pantry felt empty. The components in this dish were as simple as 1, 2, or 3: flour, water, and a pinch of salt. The dough was then molded into small balls and then placed in boiling water to be cooked. Yes, it was simple, but it was satisfying and had enough carbs to get people through the day. If you were lucky, you could put some herbs or a pinch of whatever spices remained to make it taste better. But mostly it was about existence, not feasting. The beauty of this dish was that it could be made in large batches, and while the flavor may not have been over the top, it could feed a family when they needed it most. The flour was the only real staple many families had, and it became the base for many meals. This simple dumpling dish was an example of how a little could be turned into something more. It's not just cloth napkins and towels. Cloth nappies help a lot too. They're a lot better for saving than disposable ones, and they actually do work just as well. Is that really what you want to be spending extra on? Extra expensive diapers? You really don't need to be doing that. Hey, saving is all about cutting the corners that need trimming, and you got to get used to that. This is especially true for families who are just starting out and can't seem to find a comfortable routine or rhythm with their finances just yet. Tiki this, European that, Hawaiian hashes. Let's step away from all that for a bit. Let's delve into the Mediterranean and the Italian. Canned ham was like the instant ramen of foods back in the post-war days. In 1940, it started gaining traction as the miracle meat during World War II. It was also transported as an aid to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Canned ham was nothing fancy, which was the best thing about this meal. It was perfect for busy households or people on the run. Plus, its long shelf life was like the cherry on top. Back in the day, this was a convenience food dream come true. No fuss, no muss, just a whole lot of ham. But let's be real. Fresh ham is where it's at. Unless you're stranded on a desert island, I'd stick to the deli counter. We don't need to punish ourselves with canned meat anymore, which is why this dinner has become a part of ancient history. Imagine a world without fancy desserts or indulgent snacks. Well, that pretty much sums up the Dust Bowl era for you. Enter milk toast, which was one of the only sweet treats offered in the 30s. Milk toast was a breakfast dish consisting of toasted bread and warm milk, typically with sugar and butter. Some fancier variations included salt, pepper, paprika, cinnamon, cocoa, and raisins. Milk toast was a popular food throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially for young children. Now, this was the first choice for those feeling under the weather back in the day. Yeah, it was the classic sick people food of the Dust Bowl era. Often served with a pat of butter or a sprinkle of sugar, milk toast was a gentle food that was easy on the stomach. For every great food substitute out there is always a terrible one out there as well. One of the more eccentric replacements was turnip coffee. Yes, you read that right, turnips instead of coffee beans during the Dust Bowl. At some point, coffee became too expensive or scarce and people had to improvise, and turnips became the new hero. The process included roasting turnips, grinding them to resemble coffee, and boiling them to make a drinkable concoction. Yes, it was not as delicious as the real coffee, but it was warm, it contained caffeine, sort of, and people got that extra dose of energy they needed. Moreover, it was not nearly as expensive as the real thing. It is hard to believe today, but turnip coffee was a great idea to solve a significant issue at that time. Turnips were easy to grow, they were abundant, and they could satisfy that hunger that comes with the loss of a beloved caffeinated beverage. Frankly, I'd like to try it only for the sake of trying it, but I guess I would need some really powerful cream to make it all possible. It's probably one of the most unique ways to get your coffee intake for the day, though. Then, people were also spending a lot less on dainty, cute little jars off of Temu, Amazon, and online thrift stores. Any kind of packaging they had, they were reusing. Old pots that their grandmothers had, family heirlooms that had been passed down, and all sorts of other nifty ideas. Spending little money on storage was important back then, and it's important now too. As nice as it is to constantly have your phone ringing with a package on its way. Notification, maybe your bank account could breathe a little bit more if you reused a jar or 3. This is not a joke, but the next thing you will be hearing is peanut butter and onions. Exactly, during the Dust Bowl, people could not afford to use peanut butter and sweet spreads, so they had to make do with what they had, which was to add a savory touch to the sandwiches. The peanut butter and onion sandwich came from the need to have a salty, protein-rich sandwich that has a kick from the onion. Well, this may sound like the most unusual pairing you've ever come across, but the components were basic. A thick layer of peanut butter, onions thinly sliced, and served on any bread that was available. It was a good blend of the creamy, nutty taste of the peanut butter and the sharp, pungent taste of the onions, at least when one is hungry enough to take it. The sandwich may have been a bit of a shock to the taste buds, but it did the trick of providing a quick meal with protein, complex carbohydrates, and fat. Also, it did not cost much and was filling, 2 important factors during the Dust Bowl. Okay, it may seem strange, but if you had to endure the Dust Bowl, you would not think twice about making a sandwich with peanut butter and onions. It's a rather perverse example of how food innovation thrives under pressure. So pork chops and pierogi might seem like a bit of a mouthful, both to pronounce and to imagine, but this Polish dish brings America's favorite into one well-synced harmony of flavors. I'm talking meat, cheese, and potatoes, plus pork chops with pierogi, which are boiled and pan-fried to add that all-important crispiness you and I can't go without. The pierogi fillings can be dried mushrooms or sauerkraut. It doesn't have to be just potatoes and cheese. Meat prices were definitely more expensive in the 1970s, so you might be wondering how a dish like this lands on a budget-friendly list. That's because while pork, yes, was expensive, this dish didn't highlight the pork as a standalone selling point. It had the pierogi and vegetables going for it too, which meant that you didn't need a lot of pork, just enough for it to work as a combination. If you've ever spent time in Polish-American neighborhoods or restaurants, you've probably seen this dish around. And if you ever get the chance to, this mainstay of Eastern Europe's food is definitely worth trying. Hoover's stew got its name from President Hoover, who was blamed for the economic hardship of the 30s. It was a hodgepodge of whatever ingredients you had on hand, thrown together in a pot and cooked until it was tender. It might have included meat, potatoes, carrots, and other vegetables, and was a way to use up leftovers. The hot dogs provided protein, the canned vegetables added some much-needed nutrients, and the pasta helped to bulk up the dish. Hoover stew came about during the Great Depression in the early 1930s. Folks had to pinch a penny so hard they'd make Lincoln cry, as they used to say. This stew is a tasty way to stretch $1 to feed more people or to make a meal with enough leftovers to take care of the next day's meals. Now, everyone knows that potatoes are a comfort food, but during the Dust Bowl, even the potato plant was used in ways that would make today's food bloggers cringe. Enter boiled potato vine soup, an ingenious creation that's about as far from the baked potato as you can get. It is the potato plant, the vines of which became an important food source when all other sources were depleted. The vines, which are normally thrown away, would be collected by the farmers, washed and boiled in water to make a soup. The broth was not very rich and had an earthy taste. Nothing special, but it would keep a man alive when he had nothing else. The vines also have nutrients that could sustain you, but it was more of a survival thing rather than something you'd want to eat. The soup was accompanied by what else was available, or perhaps 1 or 2 remaining vegetables or a pinch of salt. While today we may crinkle our noses at potato vine soup, it was a blessing during the Dust Bowl when any green and growing thing was fair game. At times, it is not about exotic tastes, but about survival of the fittest in this case being food. So what would you do when even most vegetables would run out? Well, people honestly just had their gardens and neighbors to fall back on. It was at the peak of the shortages where people would resort to pretty much onions stuffed with grape nuts or potato soup or just toast. Grape nuts were still just a little bit new since they were only properly introduced into the country by 1897. Of course, people warmed up to it pretty fast, given their current circumstances. It was such a good way of stuffing up onions, which were already pretty loaded with vitamins, that people just started doing it nationwide. Families really took to meatless meals because they kept them full more often and were cheaper too. The nuts were a way of adding some very direly needed sweetness to the onions. The real kicker is that you could actually just grow these right out of your victory garden. People were collecting crops like they were gold, and the ones that were super easy to grow were the most important. Still, even with the grape nuts, onions weren't exactly an inspiring lunch. No wonder you don't ever hear about this stuff, even if you look into the 50s and 60s. Avoiding bottled water is a bit of an extreme one, but it's actually more sensible than you'd think. See, reusing bottles helps to avoid the cost of constantly buying new water bottles. Lots of people during the Depression would pretty much just save money by reusing one bottle and drinking tap water instead of constantly going and buying new ones. Again, it's a small drop, get it? Because it's water in the bucket right now, but it adds up eventually. Oxtail. The cut of meat that might make you cringe at first, but during the Dust Bowl was a real hero on the table. Aspic, on the other hand, is probably something you haven't thought about since that one time you tried Jell-O salad at a family reunion. However, during the Great Depression, oxtail aspic was a good way of making a few pounds of meat go a long way without having to spend a lot of money. The secret to making oxtail aspic was, of course, the oxtail, which is a cut of meat that is famous for being rather sinewy and full of flavor. When farmers stewed the oxtail for hours, they separated the bones and fat, leaving them with a thick, sticky broth. They would then pour that broth into molds, let it cool and solidify, and there you have it, oxtail aspic, a gelatinous delicacy made from beef. The meat inside would set into the jelly, making it a perfect snack or dish on the side. It wasn't elegant by any means, but oxtail aspic was full of flavor and protein. It was a way of utilizing a cheap cut of meat and getting the best out of it as possible. Oxtail aspic might be the most underrated dish of survival cooking. Last but not least, mulligan stew was the ultimate Dust Bowl survival dish. The Dust Bowl era was a time of scarcity, and people had to get creative with their meals. Mulligan stew was the epitome of this resourcefulness. It was a one-pot wonder, made with whatever ingredients were on hand. Meat, potatoes, carrots, and any other leftover vegetables could find their way into the pot. Mulligan stew might not have had a consistent recipe or flavor, but its purpose was clear: to provide a hearty, nourishing meal from whatever could be salvaged. So, which of these Dust Bowl foods would you have loved? Let us know in the comments. If you liked the video, give us a like and subscribe. So the last stop on our list is probably as good as it got back then. There is nothing like taking advantage of nature's bounty with sweet dishes like Apple Brown Betty's, and if the subject is how a pie can put you in the right mood, then it is criminal not to talk about these. Usually made with apples or pears, berries, and other seasonal common fruit, the fruit would be baked, and layers of sweetened crumbs would hold it all together. The dish was the textbook definition of comfort food, and it screamed grandma's cooking in a time where many people did not know if they would see their family again. Lots of folks were suffering from malnutrition and hunger, but pies like this, which are easy to make with natural ingredients, were a blessing. Apple Brown Betty's are not as widely consumed today as they were during the World War, but back in the day, people found solace in the dessert they could make with whatever little they had. The recipe is commendable and might taste weird to us today because of our modern tastes. When the chips are down, you have to work with what you have left in the kitchen or pantry. During the Dust Bowl, that creativity resulted in a dish like bird egg soufflé, a name that sounds like a fancy dinner party, but the reality was that it was a way to make the most out of very little. Bird eggs were one of the few sources of protein after the agricultural collapse that is depicted in the novel. The name soufflé may give one an idea that it is some light, airy French delicacy. This was not the case with the dish. The bird eggs, probably quail, chicken, or any other small bird eggs, were beaten and then cooked with whatever was available like cornmeal or flour to make it more filling. It was not about making it perfect, it was about making it edible. The soufflé was then baked, and you had a fluffy though rather plain meal to get you through the day. Eggs, being rich in protein, were a vital resource during the Dust Bowl. They could be prepared in different ways: scrambled, baked, or fried. Thus, a bird egg soufflé may not be a five-star meal, but it could certainly give one the strength to go through a tough day on the farm. Would I eat it? Heck, yes. Who does not like a dish that involves eggs and ingenuity, even if it is not a sophisticated soufflé that can be ordered in a French restaurant? Another big thing that people would always do: repurposing furniture. Seriously, there was nothing like that. You could give old furniture an entirely new vibe with just a bit of paint here and there, some polish, a good dusting, and some fabric. People during the Depression went into their creative hobbies as much as they could, like sewing, crocheting, woodwork, carpentry, and stuff like that. It meant that they learned their way around the rusty and dusty furniture that they were so used to seeing in their homes and knew how to put some life back into it. Instead of going to IKEA and wasting yet another quarter of your paycheck on goods you don't need, you could just do this. If you ask someone to name one dish that describes diets during the Dust Bowl era, bean soup is the first meal that comes to mind. Beans have been man's best friend through some of the tensest times in history. They've been used in different kinds of meals through thick and thin. Bean soup was the classic bean dish of the 30s. Beans were cheap and easy to store, so they were a staple in many pantries. Bean soup could be made with any type of bean, and it was often thickened with cornmeal or bread. The simplicity of bean soup meant that it could be stretched to feed many people, and it provided a good source of protein and fiber. Bean soup might not have been the most exciting dish, but it was a staple of the Dust Bowl diet for a reason. It provided essential nutrition, was easy to make, and offered a bit of comfort and warmth. It was a reliable and nurturing meal that helped families get through some of the toughest times. One of the easiest mixes available at the time was potatoes and sausages into what would be known today as potato piglets. Maybe the naming is pretty on the nose, but the taste was to die for. Sausages were still relatively cheaper than a lot of other options, so you would commonly see people replenish their stock at butcher's markets and meat stores. What was also equally as trendy was a good potato element in any dish, even in Woolton pies like we talked about earlier. So these piglets would incorporate potatoes into sausages to satisfy that void left in American hearts. And we have to say, they did a pretty fine job. Green Goddess dressing is exactly as fancy as it sounds, and it's definitely a step above your average French dressing or Caesar salad. I mean, come on, if we are supposed to eat salads every other day, you gotta keep some different ones in your rotation, right? Turnip greens were a common green leafy vegetable during the Dust Bowl, when other greens like spinach and lettuce were a rare sight. I guess you can say crops had seen better days, so turnips were cooked down with a little bit of bacon or salt pork for flavor. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. They were often cooked down with a bit of bacon grease or other fat to add flavor and make them more palatable. Whether served as a side dish, added to soups, or mixed into stews, turnip greens help to round out meals and provide essential nutrients. Turnip greens might not be everyone's favorite, but they were a necessary part of the Dust Bowl diet. I'd take the subscription a step further and say instead of sharing accounts, you should also actively cancel subscriptions you don't use often. By often, I mean every other day at the very least. Seriously, why are you paying dozens of dollars for PS Plus Premium or Netflix when you buy like one game at a discount and watch a total of 2 movies, one of which you've already been spoiled for on Twitter? Does that make any financial sense to you? If you have any subscriptions that are just dead weights, it's time to cut them loose. We have a pretty exciting mix of sour cream, fresh parsley, tarragon, anchovies, and olives to make a rich green dressing that works amazingly as a dip or a salad. See, this dish got super trendy in the 70s because it was one of the first salads that people could eat and enjoy as a standalone meal. It was giving Americans options they didn't know they had, and it definitely boomed in places like California and San Francisco. Even today, it's a classic of the state's cuisine. It was first made by chef Philip Romer during his stay at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, so it's definitely got some backstory with the place. He wanted to make it in honor of the play with the same name. He was a big fan of the main actor in it, George Arliss. Philip thought European beans were a staple, and pairing them with ham was a Southern favorite. It was a hearty meal that would stick to your ribs. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good bowl of beans and ham hocks? A variation of this was known as the United States Senate bean soup, or simply Senate bean soup, which was a soup made with navy beans, ham hocks, and onion. It was served in the dining room of the United States Senate every day, in a tradition that dates back to the early 20th century. The original version included celery, garlic, and parsley. One of the 2 versions used today includes mashed potatoes. The ham hocks added flavor to the beans, and the whole thing was slow cooked until the meat fell off the bone. It might not have been gourmet, but it was definitely satisfying. During the Depression, it was extremely common for lots of households to be out of detergent. When they would do their laundry, they would instead use vinegar to get rid of any unpleasant odors and soften their clothes. It would help in saving bills because vinegar was a lot easier to get and a lot more affordable than detergent was. Plus, it would last just as long, if not longer. You wouldn't need to take an extreme amount of the stuff anyway, and hey, if it works for cat pee, I think it'll do wonders for a bunch of sweat stains on your shirt. Now people who had chickens as pets had the luxury of eating hard-boiled eggs for breakfast. Let's be honest, we all love a sunny side-up, but hard-boiled eggs just hit differently. This classic breakfast food got a workout during the Dust Bowl. Eggs were a valuable source of protein and could be stored for a longer time. Eggs, when hard-boiled, had a longer shelf life compared to raw eggs. This made them a practical choice for preservation, as they could be stored and used over time without spoiling quickly. Plus, boiling eggs is easy no matter how challenging the times get. They could be sliced into salads, added to casseroles, or simply enjoyed as a snack. These weren't just a breakfast item. These eggs were also used in dinner meals and were often served with white sauce over rice. Vegetarian chopped liver was a pretty good alternative to the lack of meat overall. I know I also said that liver was a bit more popular thanks to the rationing and the tight supply of meat, but even that would run out at some point. Plus, these aren't concrete facts that apply to every area or neighborhood. Places in the South had a way different focus in regards to their diet than people in California or Washington. Rural neighborhoods definitely couldn't afford meat of any kind, premium cut or bottom-of-the-barrel stuff. Thanks to that, vegetarian food really took off. The scene was pretty much already set for it, with mock food culture constantly proving that you can at least get comfortably close to the flavors you couldn't have. Vegetables were just another way of imitating those same dishes, but this time in a way that doesn't put a hole in your finances. Chopped liver was pretty much a massive staple in Ashkenazi Jewish culture, but they started putting out vegetarian chopped liver recipes thanks to all the shortages, which were extremely regular. When did survival stop tasting like home? If one of these vanished dishes ever sat on your family table, drop your memory below and hit like and subscribe to keep their stories alive.